You're miles from the trailhead, the forecast looked manageable, but now the sky is doing something very different. Whether you realize it or not, you're already making decisions that will shape how the rest of this trip unfolds. And the next few hours usually decide how your trip ends. What most people don't realize is that weather problems rarely start with the weather itself. They start earlier when we lock ourselves into a trip plan without leaving room for flexibility. A set mileage goal, a campsite reservation, or a carefully mapped itinerary can slowly turn from being a guide into an idea of our trip that we feel obligated to protect. You've put time into the planning, maybe driven hours to get to your destination, and changing course can feel like admitting that you misjudged something. The problem is that worsening weather rarely demands dramatic last-second heroics. More often, it demands flexible thinking before the conditions fully unravel. If you wait until the weather forces you to make a decision, your options have already shrunk. But if you loosen your plan early, mentally at least, you keep some control as the situation develops. Now, not all bad weather is an emergency, and treating every uncomfortable moment like one can lead to some bad calls. Cold rain, strong wind, and low visibility are unpleasant, but ultimately just kind of part of backpacking. What matters is how those conditions interact with other variables: the terrain, how much daylight is left, the amount of exposure, and your energy level. A windy ridgeline is a very different problem than a sheltered valley, and the same forecast can mean very different levels of risk depending on where you are and how you're moving through the day. This is where experience actually helps, but only if you slow down enough to actually use it. Instead of asking emotional questions like, can I tough this out? It's often better to ask practical ones. Can you stay warm if you have to stop? Can you navigate accurately if visibility gets even worse? Do you have a buffer of daylight, food, and energy reserves if things take longer than expected? Bad weather matters less than how prepared you are to deal with it when things start going sideways. And if this kind of decision making is what you're here for, that's what most of this channel focuses on. So there's a common belief that having the right gear solves most weather problems. And good gear helps, but it doesn't replace judgment. A waterproof shell doesn't fix a bad campsite choice. Even a high-end shelter still needs a protected campsite in order to work how it's supposed to. Deteriorating weather tends to expose gaps in our systems. Leaving your gloves at home can make sense when the forecast looks mild, but if cold rain settles in unexpectedly, now, numb fingers will turn your routine tasks into slow ones. A shelter that's perfect in calm conditions becomes frustrating when the wind rips through and you're already exhausted. The people who struggle with weather aren't always missing the right equipment. They're often relying on routines that only work when the conditions stay friendly. The hikers who adapt best are the ones who can shift their plans based on the conditions without things falling apart. Once you're on the trail and conditions start diverging from what you expected, the original forecast becomes background information. You can often throw it right out. What matters more is what you're observing right now. Wind direction, cloud movement, temperatures dropping, how fast conditions are changing. Those signals usually tell you way more than refreshing the weather app. Sure, checking the forecast again can be helpful, but it shouldn't override what your own senses are showing you in real time. And this is where trips usually start going sideways. The forecast might say that conditions will improve later, so people keep hiking even as things get worse in front of them. The wind picks up, the rain's getting heavier. You start getting that ominous feeling as the clouds start looking really dark. But because nothing has really failed yet, it's easy to convince yourself to keep moving. Because the forecast said that the rain should clear by 5 p.m., right? Well, this is usually the moment when the cost of that plan becomes impossible to ignore. You might have another 3 miles to your campsite when you hear that first crack of thunder, or the wind gets so strong that it blows your rain cover off, or you realize your waterproof jacket is already soaked through. At this point, the forecast you pulled that morning is basically meaningless. And even though none of these things are emergencies on their own, they begin to change the consequences of just marching on if the weather doesn't improve or gets worse. Now, it's not just the distance anymore, it's how long you'll be exposed, how much energy you'll burn trying to stay warm, how few good places you have left to stop as conditions keep deteriorating. That's when you realize you actually have a decision to make. This is the uncomfortable part to talk about on trail. Turning around, stopping early, or changing your plan is often seen as giving up. That framing is backwards. The strongest decision in worsening weather is usually the one that preserves your options, not the one that proves how tough you are. And that can feel counterintuitive when everything is telling you to just keep going. But the decision doesn't have to be dramatic. It might mean dropping into a lower route. It might mean stopping earlier than planned while you still have good options. It might mean changing tomorrow's plan instead of hiking late into worsening weather. It's not a mistake to be cautious in these situations. The real mistake is waiting until the conditions force your hand. All right, so now you're in it. Conditions are deteriorating, every mile is getting harder, and continuing forward isn't the obvious choice anymore. At that point, the goal is simple: buy yourself some time. You can do that by staying dry, staying fueled, and reducing your exposure. That often means sheltering for a while under some tree cover, eating sooner than usual, and simplifying your decisions as much as possible. The goal isn't to beat the weather, it's to give yourself time and options. And this is also where communication matters. If you're hiking with partners, getting all on the same page with your plan is critical. Mixed expectations within the group creates hesitation, and hesitating when a situation is stressful burns energy. Having a calm conversation with your group early, as soon as the weather starts to change, can prevent those rushed decisions later. Now, if the weather turns worse than you planned, that doesn't automatically mean that you need to stop or change your plan. Sometimes continuing in the face of bad weather is still the right call, but only if you can maintain three things: warmth, awareness, and flexibility. Some of my favorite days on trail have been hiking through storms. There's an intensity to it that's hard to match. But after 100+ trips, I'm constantly checking both the conditions and my own capacity. If I'm having trouble staying warm, navigating confidently, or keeping my plan flexible, I know it's time to reassess. When weather turns worse than expected, the real goal isn't to out-hike it or out-gear it, it's to keep the situation from getting out of control. That might mean continuing on. It might mean changing the route. It might mean calling the trip early. None of these outcomes are failures when they're chosen deliberately before the conditions force your hand. Finishing every trip isn't the mark of true experience. Returning with enough energy, clarity, and confidence to keep going on future trips is. So if you want to see a few of the items that I rely the most on out there, regardless of the conditions, check out this next video. It breaks down the 5 things I never leave behind. So stay safe out there, and I'll see you on the trail.